What if God doesn't exist? Not your God, not my God, not the God of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, or any of the thousands of religions humanity has created throughout its history. What if the entire idea of a supernatural being watching over us, judging us, protecting us, and waiting for us after death is something that human beings invented? It's an uncomfortable question. For billions of people, belief in God is not simply an opinion. It is the foundation of their morality, their identity, their family, their culture, and their understanding of what happens when they die. But here's the strange thing. Humanity existed for an extraordinarily long time before anyone wrote down the idea of one universal God. For most of recorded history, humans worshipped many gods. Gods of the sun, gods of the sea, gods of fertility, gods of war, gods of harvest, gods who lived in mountains, rivers, trees, and storms. And then, relatively recently in human history, something changed. The gods began to disappear, and one god began to take their place. So why? And perhaps the more important question, did we discover God, or did we create him? Today I'm going to argue that the evidence points much more strongly towards the second possibility. Let's begin with something important. Nobody knows when human beings first conceived of supernatural beings. Religion almost certainly predates written history. By the time civilizations began leaving written records, however, the world was already full of gods. Ancient Mesopotamia had an enormous pantheon. Ancient Egypt had Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and many others. The Greeks had Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, and the rest. The Romans eventually absorbed and renamed many of these gods. And these weren't simply different names for the same god. They were different religious systems with different gods, stories, rituals, and explanations for the world. Polytheism was normal. Monotheism, the belief that there's only one god, appears much later and developed in more than one ancient setting. One of the earliest striking experiments was Atenism in ancient Egypt during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE. Akhenaten elevated the Aten, the solar disk, to supreme status and attempted to suppress the worship of the traditional Egyptian gods. But Atenism was short-lived. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt returned to its traditional religious system. The development of Israelite monotheism was much longer and more complicated. Scholars generally understand it as a historical process, rather than something that appeared fully formed overnight. Zoroastrianism in ancient Persia is another important part of the story, although scholars debate exactly how and when it became genuinely monotheistic. So there isn't one neat moment when somebody suddenly invented the idea of God. There was something more interesting. Human beings gradually moved from a world filled with gods towards religions centered upon one supreme divine authority, and that change had enormous consequences. Because once there is one God, there is potentially one ultimate authority, and that idea has always had political power. Imagine you're a ruler. You can tell your population, I am powerful because I have an army. That's convincing. But there's an even more powerful argument. I am powerful because God has chosen me. Now disagreement with the ruler can become something much more serious than political disagreement. It can become disobedience against the divine order itself. This isn't simply a criticism of religion, it's a historical observation. The medieval European doctrine of the divine rights of kings, for example, explicitly claimed that monarchs derived their authority from God and therefore could not be held accountable by earthly political authorities. And the political usefulness of religion doesn't require rulers to be consciously manipulating their populations. A belief system can reinforce social order even when everyone involved sincerely believes it. Religions can tell the poor, be honest, be obedient, be charitable, accept your suffering. Your reward may come in the next life. Meanwhile, the powerful can maintain their position in this one. And that is where we should be careful. Religion has also inspired resistance to tyranny, abolitionism, charity, civil rights movements, and extraordinary acts of personal sacrifice. So I'm not arguing that religion was invented solely to control the poor. That claim is too simple. I'm arguing something narrower. A belief in divine authority can be extremely useful to those who already possess earthly authority. And throughout history, human beings have repeatedly discovered that usefulness. But perhaps the greatest human problem that religion attempts to solve isn't poverty or politics or morality, it's death. Because eventually every human being faces the same terrifying fact: you will die. And so will everyone you love. Religion offers an extraordinary response. Death may not be the end. There may be another life, another world, heaven, paradise, reincarnation, a reunion with those who have gone before us. And suddenly death becomes not an ending, but a transition. This matters because belief in God and belief in an afterlife are deeply intertwined in many religious traditions. And there's an interesting pattern here. As people grow older, belief in God generally becomes more common. Recent Pew Research Center research across 35 countries found that adults aged 50 and older were generally more likely than adults under 35 to say that they believe in God. In the United States, the difference was particularly pronounced. 85% of adults 50 and older expressed belief in God, compared with 66% of those under 35. This doesn't prove that people believe because they're getting closer to death. It can't. There are many possible explanations, but the pattern is worth considering, because the closer we come to the one event we cannot escape, the more attractive it may become to believe that death isn't really the end. And now we arrive at perhaps the most difficult question of all. Not, does God exist, but what kind of God would exist? Suppose we define God as omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. Then consider the world we actually inhabit. Children are born with devastating illnesses. People die painfully from diseases they did nothing to deserve. Earthquakes bury families. Wars slaughter people who never wanted war. Babies die. Good people suffer. Cruel people sometimes prosper. And innocent people can spend an entire lifetime experiencing misery. The religious answer is often that God has a reason. Perhaps suffering teaches us something. Perhaps humans possess free will. Perhaps God's plan is beyond our understanding. Perhaps the suffering will be compensated in the next life. But notice what happens. The explanation keeps moving somewhere we cannot observe, and that creates an extraordinary philosophical problem. If an all-powerful and perfectly loving God exists, why does a world containing so much apparently unnecessary suffering look exactly like the world we would expect if no such God existed? That question doesn't prove there is no God. It is a serious problem for the idea of a perfectly good interventionist God. And then there's another question. Look across the entire planet. Do any other animals appear to worship a deity? Do elephants pray to an elephant god? Do wolves sacrifice food to a wolf deity? Do whales gather to worship the creator of the ocean? Do chimpanzees construct temples? No. As far as we can determine, religious belief is uniquely human. Now that doesn't prove God doesn't exist. An alien could be real even if no other animal knew about it. And humans certainly shouldn't assume that because animals don't understand something, it doesn't exist. But the absence is still fascinating because humans are the only species we know of that has constructed elaborate explanations involving invisible supernatural beings, moral judgment after death, and divine intervention in the universe. And perhaps that tells us something. Maybe religion is evidence of God, or perhaps it is evidence of something else. The extraordinary ability of the human brain to find agency, meaning, and intention in an otherwise chaotic universe. Here's the part I find most difficult to ignore. Humanity has created thousands of gods, and remarkably often, those gods look a lot like the societies that created them. Ancient warlike societies produced powerful gods of war. Agricultural societies worshipped gods connected with fertility, rain, and harvest. Seafaring cultures developed gods associated with oceans and storms. Kings became divine, ancestors became divine, natural forces became divine, and eventually in some cultures, the gods became less human-looking and more abstract. But there was another remarkable feature. Our gods tend to care about the things we care about. Sex, marriage, food, clothing, family, tribal loyalty, moral behavior, who we should obey, who belongs to the group, who doesn't, and what happens after death. That begins to suggest something uncomfortable. Perhaps humanity didn't discover gods. Perhaps humanity repeatedly created supernatural explanations for the things it couldn't explain, and then gradually refined those explanations as civilization changed. Now, before we go any further, let's be intellectually honest. None of this proves that God doesn't exist. And this distinction is enormously important. You cannot prove a universal negative simply by pointing to the absence of evidence. A believer can always say, God exists outside the things you can measure, and perhaps that's true. But there's a problem. If a claim cannot be tested, cannot be observed, cannot be falsified, and can explain absolutely anything, then what evidence could possibly distinguish that claim from an invention? That's where my argument begins. I'm not saying science has proven there is no God. It hasn't. I'm saying something different. When we examine the evidence available to us, we see human beings creating gods in different places, at different times, according to their own cultures. We see religions changing, gods disappearing, gods merging, gods becoming subordinate, gods becoming supreme, and eventually one God becoming the answer to everything. That looks remarkably like the history of a human idea. But perhaps the most important question isn't whether God exists, it's whether we need God. Do we need a supernatural being to tell us not to murder? Do we need God to understand that children shouldn't be abused? Do we need divine instruction to know that stealing from someone who has nothing is wrong? I don't think we do. Human beings can construct morality from something much more immediate, other human beings. We live together. We depend upon one another. Your freedom affects mine. My actions affect you. Your safety matters because you are a conscious human being capable of experiencing pain, happiness, fear, and love. And from that simple recognition, an enormous moral framework can emerge. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't exploit. Protect children. Care for the vulnerable. Keep your promises. Respect consent. Punish people who deliberately harm others. And perhaps most importantly, try to leave the world in a condition in which other people can live decent lives. None of this requires a supernatural explanation. It requires empathy, reason, cooperation, and laws created by people who understand that they themselves are vulnerable. So, does God even exist? I don't know, and neither does anyone else. But if you ask me which explanation seems most convincing, I would bet on humanity. I think we invented God because we were frightened, because we were curious, because storms needed an explanation, because death was unbearable, because suffering demanded meaning, because rulers needed authority, and because human beings have always wanted to believe that the universe is watching, that our lives matter, that our loved ones aren't really gone, and that somewhere beyond this brief and extraordinary experience of being alive, there is something waiting for us. Perhaps there is, but perhaps the most remarkable thing is that we don't need an eternity to make life meaningful. Perhaps life matters precisely because it is temporary. Perhaps morality doesn't require heaven watching us. Perhaps we can be good because other people can suffer. Perhaps we can love because we understand how precious another human being is. And perhaps instead of looking upward for someone to tell us how to live, we should look around at one another. Because if there is no God, then we have inherited something far more important than divine instruction. We've inherited responsibility. There may be nobody coming to save us, which means we have to save one another. And perhaps that isn't a frightening conclusion. Perhaps it's a liberating one. Because if this is the only life we have, then every kindness matters more. Every friendship matters more. Every child matters more. Every moment matters more. We don't need to wait for the next life to make this one better. We have life. We have this life. We have one another. And for now, perhaps that's enough. If you found this video interesting, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys questioning the things we often take for granted. And most importantly, Keep asking questions, because sometimes the most important question isn't whether we know the answer, it's whether we're brave enough to ask.